Hello. Today we're going to talk about using a couple of instruments that were developed initially by Sundberg and Partington, and then the revised version was developed by Partington. And it's the ABLS-R, but we're going to talk a bit about the BLA as well. The BLA, the Behavioral Language Assessment, was also developed by them, and I still think is a useful instrument to be familiar with. The ABLS-R is one of the main instruments that we use for doing a skills assessment at kind of a microscopic level. Where is this individual in a number of different core areas of the curriculum? So let's talk first about assessment in general. Assessment precedes goal development. All of our IEP goals, all of our IHP goals, all of the goals that we would develop for individuals that we work with should be preceded by an assessment. And the assessment that we do, because of the nature of autism and the kinds of deficits that people with autism have, we really have to do real-life assessments of skills, really look at their functional demonstration of skills, not their performance on some kind of standardized measure. And we want to focus on the breadth and depth of skills. In other words, it's not that useful to say, yes, this individual can mand, or no, this individual cannot mand. What we need to know is, well, how well can they mand? For how many types of things can they mand? How spontaneously can they mand? Do they mand in new and novel contexts? Do they require support from adults in order to mand? Those kinds of questions are the important questions from the perspective of actual functional use of skills. And from an assessment perspective, we want our assessments to serve that behavior analytic function. And so ultimately, we want assessment to guide programming. And we want that assessment to include all of those issues I just mentioned. Contexts that it's done in, spontaneity, extent of the skill, the consistency with which the individual demonstrates the skill, and their level of independence in the skill. And Sundberg and Partington developed the ABLS, and then Partington revised it into the ABLS-R. And they also talk about an instrument called the Behavioral Language Assessment, which is used to pinpoint skills and deficits and to guide programming. And from that kind of quick measure in which one can select priorities for the learner, they've identified some level profiles. This is not a comprehensive assessment instrument. This is a quick read on a learner, particularly, for example, a learner who might be new to your setting or to your classroom, for whom you're trying to get a quick impression. But it does give us a starting point and some instructional priorities from a curricular perspective. Sundberg and Partington developed the BLA and the ABLS initially because really they were dissatisfied with the way language assessments were usually done. They noted that generally individuals looked at receptive and expressive capacities, gave some kind of age-equivalent chronological score, and while it might have been a measure of how a language problem exists, it didn't give a lot of specific information. And much of the language testing that was done was standardized, which meant that they were doing novel material, novel questions in an unfamiliar environment, often with an unfamiliar examiner. Correct responses weren't reinforced, all the deficits and problems associated with standardized testing. And they found that language testing didn't usually give very specific information about language and didn't provide a starting point. So alternatively, what they suggested and what became the ABLS is that they wanted to really identify specific communication deficits, and they wanted to serve as a guide for language programming. They wanted the assessment to be linked to meaningful language programming. And their information gathering included the idea that we should sample a variety of contexts and motivational conditions and formal and informal kinds of contexts and parent and teacher observations. And in the context piece, they took into account generalization and they took into account the functional use of skills. And in the motivational conditions, they wanted to look at when motivation was high versus when motivation was low. They also emphasized the importance of parent and teacher input and the natural context. Now, one of the things that was different and novel about Sundberg and Partington's approach to language acquisition is the use of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior. as an analytical tool, as a frame of reference, as a framework for how language should be conceptualized and possibly ultimately taught. Their goal was to get information about every one of those verbal operants that are described and discussed in the VB classification system, and looking at the variables that would be most relevant to the functional demonstration of those skills, including level of independence, generalization, rate of acquisition of new material. And their position in doing any kind of language assessment is that it should begin with the establishment of rapport. They focus a great deal on pairing. They focus a great deal on the importance of having a connection with the learner, in part so you know what's going to function as reinforcement, and in part so that whatever reinforcement you provide is in fact rewarding to them. We want to establish ourselves as agents of reinforcement. We want to play with the child. We want to give a lot of freebies. We want to build their approach behaviors toward us. We want to reduce their avoidance behaviors toward us. Those are some of the most important tasks that we have in terms of looking at how we engage the learner. And ultimately, that also helps with the development of stimulus control. The more rapport and relationship we have with the individual, the more likely they are to follow our instructions. They talked about doing a few different things: observing the child in their natural environment, interviewing the child's parents and teachers, and formally, directly examining the skill levels of the child. Their approach was actually called natural environment training. They believed very strongly in the use of the natural environment, both as an assessment environment and as a teaching environment. From an assessment perspective, definitely there's familiarity. This is the place where they spend every day, all day. And a lot of language occurs in the context of ongoing daily activities. So it's really a perfect context to get a real-world read on how well this individual understands various aspects. Now, what about if you need a quick assessment for a new student? As I mentioned, the behavioral language assessment was designed for exactly this purpose. And I'm going to talk about the 12 areas. Again, as I mentioned, with a caveat, it is not the comprehensive ABLES-R, which is a really comprehensive skill assessment. It is a much quicker tool that we use for new students and to get a quick read on priorities for instruction. But I think it has some very interesting areas in it. And the first one is cooperation with adults. I just love that this is in there because it's such an issue for so many individuals with autism at every age of instruction. It's centrally important in terms of the success of any of our other instructional efforts. And it looks at the need for powerful rewards and the presence of disruptive behavior. And in all of Sundberg's and Partington's work, what you will see consistently is that there's an emphasis on operationally defining various levels of skill acquisition and a numeric assignment to those different levels so that we can rank children in various ways. So if you look at cooperation with adults, the question that's posed is, how easy is it to work with this child? And a 1 is always uncooperative, avoids work, engages in negative behavior. You can picture the kids in your histories that would get a 1. And I can too. The kinds of children who really had no ability to tolerate instruction, who'd not developed any tolerance for demands, and who spend much of their day engaged in aberrant behavior, which only increases when they're required to do something. A 2 will give only one brief and easy response for a powerful reinforcer. A 3 will give 5 responses without disruptive behavior. So here we see a bit more stamina, a bit more ability to tolerate. A 4 will work for 5 minutes, and a 5 will work for 10 minutes at a table without disruptive behavior. So think about the evolution of stimulus control there. Think about the ability of the individual to engage in work behaviors with increased stamina. And think about the degree to which challenging behaviors are no longer interfering with your ability to issue instructions, get responses, etc. So that's an interesting one. The next one is requests or mands, which is a critically important skill. And this can vary from absent to non-vocal to vocal. The modality is not really important. There's always a focus on function, not form, when we talk about VB. But a 1 in this, the question asked is, how does the learner let his needs and wants be known? So what is the way that this individual currently is communicating their wants and needs to us? A 1 is cannot ask for reinforcers or engages in negative behavior. So we don't see any functional manding in children who would score a 1 there. A 2 pulls people, points, or stands nearby, reinforcing items. So there's a little communication here. If I want to go outside, I stand by the sliding glass door. If I want a drink, I go to the refrigerator, or I pull mom to the sink, right? So those are the beginnings of mands, something for us to shape. So that's a 2. A 3 is used as 1 to 5 words, signs, or pictures to ask for reinforcers. Again, it can be words, signs, or pictures. We are unconcerned with form. We're concerned with function. Are they actually requesting? The next one uses 5 to 10 words, signs, or pictures to ask for reinforcers. And the last one is frequently requests using 10 or more words, signs, or pictures. So you can see there that what we've got is just the very beginnings of manding to a little bit stronger repertoire for manding. Motor imitation is next. It examines fine as well as gross motor imitation, which we know is centrally important in developing all kinds of other skills. And the question asked is, does the learner copy actions? Number 1 is can't imitate anybody's. Number 2, imitates a few, modeled by others. 3 is several on request. 4 is several fine and gross motor. And 5 is any fine or gross motor, often spontaneously. So you see a 5 there for those of you who recall from the imitation sequences, is generalized imitation, right? And we know that that's our ultimate goal. So that's a quick assessment of where the learner might be in that context. Vocal play. Sundberg and Partington thought that vocal play was important in terms of prediction for language acquisition. And so the question is, how does the learner spontaneously say sounds and words? Doesn't make any as a 1, makes a few at a low rate as a 2, vocalizes many with varied intonations as a 3, 4 is that with including a few words, and 5 is many words. Vocal imitation, or echoics, which is very important for vocal language acquisition in terms of having it as an effective prompt, and can predict how easy vocal communication is going to be. And again, you see the same kind of thing, where it can't repeat any is a 1, all the way up to clearly repeats any word or simple phrase. Matching to sample. Here they talk about, matching to sample is important because it's so functional for so many other more important cognitive skills, but it includes attending to visual stimuli, discrimination training between stimuli, task completion skills, and it's the building block for so many other things like sorting and classification kinds of tasks. So similarly, they say can't match any objects or pictures to a sample, can match 1 or 2, can match 5 to 10, and then a 4 would be 5 to 10 colors, shapes, or designs, and 5 would be matches most items, and 2 to 4 block designs. So again, getting a little more abstract, pulling it out. Remember that some of the themes in Sundberg and Partington's work is breadth and depth, and as you look at these and as you later look at the ABLES, you'll see those same themes. Receptive skills. Does the learner understand any words or follow directions? Can't understand any. Can understand a few related to daily routines, so there could be a lot of contextual assistance in those. Follow a few to do actions or touch items. Many instructions and point to 25 is a 4, and a 5 is 100 items, actions, persons, or adjectives. Again, breadth across all those things, right? Items, actions, persons, adjectives, and depth. Breadth and depth, 100 at least, and across all those different areas. Those are themes that you should remember when you see both the BLA and the ABLES. Labeling, tacting, labeling common items and actions. It involves the child as a speaker, not listener, so it's not receptive, it's expressive, and includes both retrieval of what that word is and the correct pronunciation. So Inherently, it also includes echoic skills. And children who don't acquire this skill are at a great loss, they say in their book. They see it as important in terms of cognitive potential. A 1 can identify any, a 2 is 1 to 5, then 6 to 15, 16 to 50, and over 100. Again, you see the breadth and depth. Sundberg and Partington, while they used Skinner's VB classification system for the expressive components of language, the individual as speaker, a mand or a request, a tact or an expressive label, an intraverbal, a to and fro conversational exchange, and a echoic, just verbal imitation. They also knew that many other listener behaviors were extremely important to the individual functioning. And so their behavioral language assessment and their ABLES both include not just the verbal operants from Skinner's VB classification system, but also a number of other skills like imitation, like receptive language. And this one, which is unique, receptive by feature, function, and class, in which the individual identifies and reacts to something not by name, but when told something about it. So whether it's its feature, its function, or its class. So a fruit that is red and crunchy, for example. Something we eat with that is, round and used for soup. Those kinds of things. It's a different level of language comprehension than touch spoon. And so, touch the animal with a long neck. Touch the animal who lives in a zoo. Touch the animal that can fly. Touch the animal that swims in the water. Which one is a fish? All of those would be things that would fall into this RFFC. And the question they ask is, do they identify items when given information about those items? A 1, they cannot. A 2, they can do a few if they're given synonyms or common functions. A 3, they can do 10 given 1 of 3 functions or features. A 4, they'll do 25 given 4 function, features, or classes. A 5, 100 given 5. So again, breadth and depth. What do I know about an apple? Do I just know it's called apple? Or do I know it's red, it's crunchy, it has seeds, it grows on trees? That's a different level of knowledge. And so that's what they're getting at in terms of receptive by feature, function, and class, which is also a nice, unique element of language comprehension. Then they go back to Skinner's expressive speaker behaviors, intraverbals, or conversation. And the question they ask is, can the learner fill in missing words or answer questions? And this is one of their loveliest contributions, is that very often we used to think that we couldn't work on conversation with individuals with autism until they were further along in their vocal capacity. Sundberg and Partington have emphasized the importance of intraverbals, being able to participate in conversations by virtue of fill-ins. So if you want to go outside, we need your socks and shoes. It's time for bed. We have to put on our jammies and brush our teeth. Those are conversations. That is conversational speech. Technically, it absolutely meets the definition of an intraverbal. From a verbal behavior perspective, an intraverbal is I'm responding to the verbal behavior of someone else, and what I say does not match what they say. So if you say to me, what's your name? And I say Mary Jane, that's an intraverbal. Because you say, what's your name? I don't say, what's your name? Because what I say does not match what you say. In the same way, you want to go outside, you'll need your socks and shoes. You're responding to the verbal behavior of another person, and what you say does not match. So it's a nice bridge into conversational speech, and is a really nice contribution that they have made. And number 1, they say can't fill in any missing words or parts of songs. Number 2 is can fill in a few missing words or provide animal sounds. And think about typical development, right? One of the first things kids learn is animal sounds. Number 3, can fill in 10 non-reinforcing phrases or answer at least 10 simple questions. 4 can do that for 20 or can answer 20 with variations. And 5 is can answer at least 30 with variations. So look at those. Those are vastly different levels, right? The between a 1 and a 5 there is just unbelievably large. But conversational skills are an important piece of curricular development, but they've emphasized the ability to focus on it even quite early in instruction. And they give some examples, and you'll see it when we look at the ABLES. Songs, nursery rhymes, animal sounds, simple word associations. They also talk about the letters and numbers, which is often an area of strength, and written words, important to address the complete needs of the student, but not as important as other areas. And they do have a similar kind of taxonomy there of a 1. They can't do it all the way up to a 5. They can read 25 words and identify 10 numbers. Social interaction. Very nice to include this in an inventory, even a quick read on a student inventory. And one thing I really like is it emphasizes initiation and asking adults for preferred items and verbal interactions with peers. So a 1 is doesn't initiate interactions with others. A 2 approaches others to initiate an interaction. A 3 readily asks adults for reinforcers. A 4 verbally interacts with peers with assistance. And a 5 regularly initiates and sustains verbal interactions with peers. One thing I really love about that is the progression we see, right? From nothing to adult responsive to peer responsive. And so they've tried to take that progression and operationally define it in a meaningful way. So what do you do with the information from the assessment? Well, it looks very carefully at each of them, and if the deficit is severe, it would need specific and immediate attention. If you look at cooperation with adults and it's a 1 or a 2, you're going to use behavior management procedures along with a language intervention program. If it's a 3 or 4, the child's more ready to learn. If they're a 5, you're ready to teach. Similarly, you get a 1 or a 2 in manding, you're going to focus immediately and very intensively on manding skills. You might also be doing a lot of behavior intervention procedures. If a 3, you're still going to do an intensive manding program. If it's a 4 or a 5, you're probably looking at some other areas too. You're able to expand a bit. Motor imitation. If it's a 1, you've got to do immediate and intensive imitation training. They might not be a candidate for sign language. Even a 3 or 4 means we still have to work on the response class of initiation because they're not generalized imitators. And they point out that sign might be warranted if motor imitation is 3 or 4, but a COEX are a 1 or 2. Again, they're pro-sign. They tend to recommend sign over any other alternative to vocal speech. And so we would see that. But it's not a bad rule of thumb for who are the individuals we would consider it for. Certainly, those who are good imitators might be better candidates. Vocal play, again, they look at it more from a predictive perspective. If they're a 3 or 4, they might be ready for more vocal language training. And a COEC, we know a 1 is going to show us a lot of difficulty in that area. A 3 or 4 might tell us that vocal speech is feasible as their primary modality. Matching, if it's a 1, a picture-based system might be inappropriate. Maybe they're not good visual scanners. Maybe they're not able to do that. Now, I'm reluctant to say that before intervention's actually begun and we've attempted. But they're saying a nonverbal child who scores very high in this area might be a good candidate for picture-based systems. So it's all about matching your learner's characteristics with your choices. A 1 might tell us in receptive that they require both intensive training and behavior management procedures, and even a 2 or 3, we've got to broadly build those receptive skills. If a student has a 1 on tacting and is a weak mander, they're saying don't worry so much about the 1 in tacting, go for manding. Once they've begun to mand, you can do initial tact training. A 2 or 3, you still want to be doing a lot of tacting as well as other language areas. RFFC, they point out that low scores are very common in this population, and it's a later term curricular issue. They should have at least 50 tacts and receptive responses before we really start working on RFFC. But if we get a 3 or a 4 in RFFC, we might have some readiness for conversational skills. In the intraverbals, they're saying a 1 or a 2 would be absolutely expected for those whose receptive vocabularies are under 50 words, and we don't put a lot of energy into this area until we've got a 4 or 5 on labeling, receptive, and RFFC, and a 3 on intraverbals. Letters and numbers, I already mentioned, is not a serious focus early on. A social interaction score of 1 or 2 might tell us we really need to focus more on fundamental language skills. A 3, there might be some ability to verbally interact with others, and a 5 might indicate more readiness and possibly more ability to respond to natural contingencies. So if we have somebody who's mostly a level 1, they talked about level profiles, a level 1 learner, very few verbal skills, difficult to teach behavior problems. Compliance training and man training. And by compliance training, they mean more not the traditional drill sergeant kind of compliance training, but more pairing, building approach behaviors, building ourselves as agents of reinforcement, and focusing on the response class of Manding. Mostly 2s. This is somebody with some simple forms of communication that's a bit cooperative, has some behavior problems. They might have mostly 2s and some 3s in a couple of areas of the assessment. So we're going to look at Manding, increasing the variety and the number, breadth and depth. We're going to look at increasing both motor and vocal imitation skills. We're going to think about readiness for tacting and receptive language skills, and we're going to really start thinking about what the communication system is going to be. Should we focus a lot on imitation because we're going in a sign direction? Should we build various kinds of matching skills for a picture-based system? Level 3s might have a few 4s, and that tells us they've got some advanced communication skills and they're acquiring at a fast pace. Still, expanding that MAND repertoire, tacting a wider variety of objects and pictures, and increase in their receptive discrimination skills. So again, breadth. We're Manding, tacting, receptive, and depth, wider variety within each of those. 4s might have some 5s. They might have some good imitation skills. They might be able to label a number of things, but they might be weakest in RFFC and intraverbals. So those are going to be some of our biggest priorities. But we're still going to be doing labeling, receptive, more advanced Manding like WH question Manding and missing items. And we're going to think about facilitating social interactions with peers because they're showing more readiness for that. Now, this is all very relevant to the young learners. So those of you working with adolescents and adults, I hear your pain. I know that you're thinking, not really, this isn't the way we're thinking, this isn't functional for our guys, and I understand and agree. We're going to get to those instruments at other points in time. There are still areas of the ABLES that are useful for those individuals. But one of the things I want to point out about a level 4 learner is that we have to attend to rate of acquisition, because once we are looking at such a big rate of such a big breadth, we might start slowing down their pace of instruction. A level 5 person's got a sizable vocabulary but some clear deficits. We're going to work a lot on intraverbals, conversation, staying focused on topics, conversing about current events and things going on in the here and now, and complex Manding, Manding for information, Manding how and why questions. So back to the BLA, just as a summary. What does it help us do? It's a quick read. It's not a comprehensive assessment, but it identifies major language deficits. It gives us a starting place for language intervention program. It can be used as a general tracking system, though the ABLES R is superior. And what do you think about it as an index of change? It's interesting, like to think about doing this on a periodic basis, just as, you know, how do people look every September? Were they a level 1 learner last year, or are they a level 2 learner? So sometimes people use it for that, and it can be helpful for staff in that context. Remember that Sundberg and Partington are very much about assessment in the natural environment, assessment across all these functions of language, and that Manding is really centrally important in terms of how we think about a learner's skills. This is where I'm going to stop this particular vodcast, and when we come back, I'm going to talk to you about the ABLES. So I hope you enjoyed the BLA, and I'll see you real soon. Take care.